Alright folks, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be about site analysis. So the steps you want to take when you actually visit a site and begin to conceptualize what you want to accomplish there. So let me get this queued up and we'll get going. Alright, you may have encountered SWOT-C before. It is used by the military, it's used by business, it's used by all kinds of industries, including ecosystem restoration practitioners. Here's what it stands for, if you're not familiar with it: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and constraints. Sometimes you see it without the C, you see it without the constraints, but I think it's worthy of inclusion. So this is a acronym that you'll want to be very familiar with and ready to employ when you assess a project. Strengths, these are the desirable assets of the site. So for example, you may have a site that needs a lot of help, but it has this little patch of really lovely native prairie. And you want to build on that, you want to expand that. So that's a strength. Weaknesses, these are obvious stressors, ecosystem stressors, meaning they are dragging that habitat down. You know, maybe it's poor water quality coming off of the neighboring properties, delivering pesticides or fertilizers. It could really be anything, but you want to make a list of stressors and then rank them, similar to the ranking of risks that we talked about earlier. Basically, you just need to decide which weaknesses are critical for dealing with in the short term versus weaknesses that are more on a slow burn and are going to take longer to address. Opportunities. So frequently this requires several visits to a site to really begin to wrap your arms around. And it often requires lots of discussion with the landowner, with the other stakeholders, with your team. You know, we're trying in this, for opportunities, we're trying to assess the potential of a site. So for example, you know, maybe there's a pathogen that is attacking some of the large trees. But on the other hand, you might want to keep those trees there because they offer a good snag habitat for things like woodpeckers. So, you know, that's an example of a potential opportunity that a site presents. Okay, threats. Threats are something impending. It's a high risk in your risk analysis. High probability. You need to trace it to its cause and treat it early. You know, sometimes projects are rolled out in phases, where you do phase 1, 2, and 3 of a project over time. Maybe it takes several summers to really fully implement a restoration project. In that case, you want to make sure you deal with threats in that first phase. So take your stressor that is the highest risk of derailing the project altogether and address that in the early implementation. And maybe it's something that can be even addressed before you go to grant funders and ask for money to keep the project going. Constraints. So these run the gamut. It could be economic, it could be human resources, it could be time, it could be stakeholder expectations, politics, climate, just something that you're not necessarily going to be able to change, you know. So, you know, maybe there's a railroad running through the property. You would love to take that railroad away to restore the area in total, but, you know, that's very unlikely to happen if it's an active railway. So that's just a constraint you got to work around. So hopefully you understand the distinction between a threat which is something you need to deal with immediately for the project to move forward, and a constraint, which is just some limitation on the project that you have to work around, that you have to compromise around. All right, so that's SWOT-C. And this is the SWOT-C wheel for your suitability and feasibility analysis. You're going to be getting to know this real well. But basically, you can take a bunch of those things I just mentioned and break them into 4 categories: general factors, physical factors, anticipated site improvements, and biological factors. And you can go through this wheel one at a time, one topic at a time, and assign it as a strength, a weakness, an opportunity, a threat, or a constraint. So for example, let's have a look at general factors and human use patterns. So you might have a project site where there's a lot of garbage, there's a lot of dumping, there's maybe vandalism, there's illegal vehicle use on the site. So clearly it's hammered and it's getting a lot of use, albeit not positive use. That is a human use pattern that you need to acknowledge early and address. So here, the SWOT-C exercise is to understand the human use pattern and then give it an S, W, O, T, or C. Now, in the case that I just presented you, I would probably identify that as a threat, meaning you could restore the land, but if you don't address the human use pattern, all your beautiful work is going to become undone by that human use. So you may have to do some work to restrict people or to control where they go on the property, and I'll show you an example of that later. Let's have a look at another one. So anticipated site improvements. How about buffer requirements? So, you know, if you're restoring a section of stream, for example, you may want to make sure there is an adequate buffer on either side of that stream to protect the water source from adjacent land uses like agriculture or industry. And to make sure that there's sufficient habitat for riparian dependent species. So buffer requirement in that case, you know, maybe that's a constraint. Maybe the project won't be successful unless you work with a state mandated buffer requirement, for example. It's just something you got to work with as you move into your design phase. But you could classify that as a strength or a weakness depending on the context too. If the landowners aren't willing to give you that buffer, then it would definitely be a constraint or a weakness. Whereas if they're willing to provide enough land for an adequate buffer, then maybe that's an opportunity. So you can see how it's a little subjective. You're going to have to use your own discernment as to how to classify each of these categories. Okay, so that's SWOT-C. We're going to come back to that. But I want to start from the beginning. So when you learn about a potential project, one of the first things you want to do is get out some maps and do a document search. A document search is really essential so that you understand any constraints on the property that are not visibly obvious. For example, maybe there's a natural gas easement across the property that you have to work around. Maybe that's a real constraint to the project. Well, that would be evident on utility plans available through the city or the county. So, you know, as a project manager, one of your early responsibilities is to check with local government, check with state government. You're looking for things like environmental impact statements, historic maps, old photos, GIS layers, land use plans, like I said, utility maps, maybe vegetation and soil maps available through state agricultural and wildlife agencies. Really anything you can get your hands on that is going to help educate you as to the nature of the property. And you want to spend an adequate amount of time doing this, so it reduces the number of surprises that come up in a project later. Okay, your next step is to go back to the landowners again and again and just keep interviewing them, because you'd be surprised how much new information pops up just through casual conversation in walking a property. They're going to have more and interesting things to say about the land than you would ever get from a county plat map, for example, although that's an essential piece too. But really, understanding the desires and the knowledge of the people on the land is really fundamental. And communicating respectfully and listening to them without an agenda is also really essential towards moving towards compromise. So I've worked with plenty of landowners where I didn't agree with their politics, I didn't agree with their land use, but I let them talk, and I kind of sussed out their desires, and eventually you find some common ground, and you find a way for everyone involved to get some satisfaction out of the project. It's not just the immediate landowners, of course, that you want to account for, but former landowners. So maybe you can track down somebody, an old timer who he or she used to own the property, and they might know something as well. Talk to neighbors, talk to historic societies, really just spread your net wide as far as interviewing folks to understand the history of a property. That might reveal things that are threats that you weren't otherwise aware of. For example, buried underground hazardous material tanks. You don't want to find those on accident. You want to know about those up front. And sometimes these activities occur without the county planner. The landowners just do what they will, and sometimes they don't get caught. And these things have a tendency to pop up at very inopportune times when you're trying to do restoration. So again, just really candid and respectful conversations with all these folks will help. All right, so if you're in the ground-based course, you'll be going out to a site later in the term and actually using this checklist. It's available in the back of your book. It's Appendix 5. And you'll be assessing a site for its restoration potential, and you'll go through this SWOT-C exercise. When you're doing this, it's important that you complete the checklist. You print things off in a way that it's really easy to take notes, and that you perhaps repeat this activity a couple times throughout the seasons. So, a site does not look the same in winter as it does in high summer. And that might be a really important distinction to make when you're talking about restoration potential. All right, let's have a look at that wheel a little bit more. So, general site factors. You're going to need to assign an SWO, T, or C to the following. Ownership. So it's not just who owns the land. Maybe there's water rights that you have to account for. Maybe it's land use on neighboring properties that might affect your goals. You just need to look at everything with respect to ownership. And one tricky one is easements. So for example, did the owner enter into a conservation easement? Did they provide an easement to a county road or utility? All those things are really important to understand up front. Hazardous material, that I mentioned that a couple times. You need to identify those things and get them out of there if they exist. Historical context. So again, understanding prior land use will help you determine what's possible there now. And then current land use. So are there conflicts over the use of this property? Okay, continuing under general site factors. Human use, we mentioned that earlier. Political considerations. This is a tricky one. It's important that you have a local liaison. So if you're working for the state or the feds, it's very unlikely that they're going to want to talk to you. You kind of need a local contact to help introduce you to the landowner or the stakeholder. I can't reiterate this enough. It's really important to use a local land use agency as your representative if you're not one yourself. Cultural resources. Pretty much any kind of construction project is going to require that you assess a site for potential archaeological impacts. And it's crucial that you don't just check the boxes with the state, but that you actually reach out to the local tribe and let them know what you're doing, and make sure you understand their perspective and any potential concerns. And that, because you don't want to create tension where it's not needed later on. Agricultural quarantine. So are there any species, be it animal or plant, on the site that are considered pests that you really don't want to spread? So for example, if it's a highly invasive weed, the last thing you want to do is have your restoration crew driving in and out of there and the tires of their vehicles moving that weed to other pristine sites. So you may have to go through some additional quarantine steps to deal with that if that's an issue. All right, stressors on the existing ecosystem. We've talked about this before, but it really runs the gamut. It could be just about anything from roads to contaminants to drainage ditches to cattle, you name it. All right, what's the stressor here? It should be pretty obvious right away. Here we have a wetland. It's clearly being used by some waterfowl, but it's far from pristine. We have this enormous tire dump leaching God knows what chemicals into the water and limiting, I'm sure, that wetlands production potential as both habitat and a food source. So, clearly this is a threat that would need to be dealt with early on. So that's a fairly straightforward one. Let's have a look at physical factors now. So we covered general stuff. Let's talk about physical stuff now. Very often in my work, it all came down to topography. Wetlands are subtle. Very minor elevation changes can really affect how water moves on a landscape and collects on a landscape. So understanding how to make adjustments to the topography to restore wetlands was really tricky and required some very intentional investigation and modeling. You could have the opposite problem, though. You could have a very steep site where erosion is going to be an issue regardless of what you do there. So topography refers to the landform itself and what you intend to change about that landform. Elevation. So most of my restoration experience is on the coast at practically zero elevation. Restoration is going to look very different. If you're trying to restore alpine lakes up in high mountain country, you might have freeze lines or microclimates that require very different vegetation. Geology. One of the things we dealt with on the coast was the threat of tsunami. And making sure that any infrastructure we put in could withstand it. So that's an example of a geological threat, albeit an unpredictable one. Soils are so important, as you know, from your schooling so far. The depth, texture, and type of soil is you really need to understand that in order to be successful in modifying vegetation or modifying hydrology, um, it really does come down to soils very often. Hydrology, again, that's the control, um, the use of water. Um, Preferably, you're moving an ecosystem towards a more naturally functioning hydrology, but that's not always possible. You may have to implement some kind of structure to mimic nature. Here's a few other physical factors that are worth thinking about when you're assigning SWOT or C. Groundwater. So how deep is the water table? Do you really need to irrigate or not when you put plants in? This is something that, of course, can be tested with groundwater wells. There may even be existing groundwater surveys out there. Surface runoff. This is important to understand. It's not just where the water is on the landscape, but it's how frequently and how quickly does that water move and when during the year. So you might have a site that is dry as a bone, 11 months of the year, but then is prone to, monsoonal flooding. Well, you better plan your restoration such that it can withstand that. In fact, that it accommodates that kind of flooding. So that's what we mean by really addressing surface runoff. Water quality. This, of course, is the chemistry of the water and making sure that it's not harmful to either the immediate ecosystem or users and organisms downstream. And then lastly, landscape ecology. This is the concept of corridors connecting habitats, and that brings me to the next slide. What do you notice about this image? Looks like a nice enough wetland. I bet you there's some frogs in there, maybe a few fish. We've got some plantings circling the wetland. But clearly there's one major constraint here, and that is the surrounding urban landscape. It's very unlikely that this little wetland is connected to a river system or bunches of other wetlands and some sort of green corridor. I mean, more and more people are trying to implement those types of projects, but they're really difficult, especially in the built human landscape. So the landscape ecology of this particular example may not be very impressive. It may be an isolated site, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's harder to justify spending big dollars on an isolated site that doesn't offer a mosaic of benefits to the larger landscape. Okay, finally, biological factors. We're still working our way around that SWOT-C wheel. Biological factors include the existing veg, whether it's native or non-native or invasive, the vegetation dynamics. So does the vegetation require frequent flooding or frequent fire? What's the seasonality of the vegetation like? Is that an opportunity, a threat, a constraint, a strength, a weakness? Next, we have the degree of degradation. So which impact is the highest priority? So how badly impacted is the site? And how would you characterize that? Next, invasive species, habitat values. So what functions does that habitat provide, or what could it provide after restoration? Whether it's foraging, rearing, refuge, any number of things, any number of services, ecosystem services that are provided through that habitat. Wildlife, so you really need to understand the resident wildlife as well as the migratory wildlife. And sometimes the wildlife is not all that obvious because more and more these days in the human landscape, a lot of wildlife is switching to nocturnal foraging and nocturnal movement. And so sometimes this requires you to put out camera traps and other means of determining what wildlife are using the site. So this is a picture of a project I worked on in which we employed a rather unusual restoration technique. We were restoring this floodplain, and we had a lot of surplus woody debris, a lot of trees that had to be moved. And this is a tidal channel that hasn't quite been reconnected to the river system yet. And the operator just took those surplus trees and jammed them into the mud with his backhoe. And he was essentially creating complexity along the stream channel. And that complexity is really, really good habitat. It provides opportunities for birds and fish to hide. It provides more prey, like insects, than would otherwise be available on a more uniform landscape. It provides perching opportunities, and on and on. So we decided that in this case, it really didn't pay to haul that material away or to burn it and reduce air quality in the area. We just put it to work, and we found a way to use it. So that's an example of thinking hard about the habitat function you want to achieve. And that's an example of a potential cost liability that we turned into an opportunity. Anticipated improvements, speaking of opportunities, you want to make sure that you assign these SWOT-C categories to the following. Grading refers to changing the contours, the elevational contours of a site. I just talked about importing and exporting material. That can be very, very costly. You know, if you have to haul away a lot of soil or hazardous waste, it's got to go somewhere and you have to pay for it. So a good chunk of your budget might be landfill fees. You need to think hard about whether there's opportunities to avoid that. Water and drainage, you'll hear a lot about that during this course. Irrigation as well. Buffers, we talked about that. Access control, we talked about that. Vandalism as well. Here's an example of a restoration that didn't go well. It was a small project. A watershed council was protecting a spring and a wetland, and they installed a lot of plantains. And they went so far as to put in some of those cement blocks to keep people from driving into the site and damaging it. But when they came back not too long later, they found that someone had gone in, just driven around the barriers, and then with malice had pulled out all the willows, had driven through the wetland multiple times, and had more or less destroyed their work. And this was the work of hundreds of volunteers, so it was a major blow, a major setback. You know, it's not for me to say whether this could have been anticipated, whether maybe improved communication with a neighbor would have prevented this, because I don't know the details. But I can tell you that those cement blocks as a deterrent, probably not good enough, obviously. Retiring the road entirely or putting in big tank traps or some other method of controlling access to the site, although it would have been more expensive and time consuming, would have been a better protective measure for their investment. So sadly, this kind of thing does happen, and it's hard to understand. That's why it's important to identify your risks and your threats early on. Okay, so another really essential skill as a project manager is not only doing the site analysis with the SWOT-C forms, but also doing a sketch. And you may think you're an absolutely horrible craftsman or artist, no problem. We don't require any degree of proficiency with drawing, but it is important that you start to get in the habit of sketching what you see out there. So you're going to sketch all the relevant habitat features, all the relevant problem areas, the points of access, the infrastructure, and then outline the potential restoration area. And then, you know, later this serves as the basis for your preliminary designs. So it's kind of fun. You get to very early shape what's going to happen out there just by sketching as you walk around. in these days, it's also easy to send a drone up in the air and take some pictures, um, uh, or any number of things that help illustrate what's going on at the site. But the old-fashioned sketch will never go out of style. It's just something that you have to get accustomed to doing. So in this case, here's a nice example where we have a road, paved road, and a dirt road, and then we have a farm infrastructure here. The person who sketched this did a nice job of putting in some lines to indicate elevation. They did a little hatch marks here to indicate riparian vegetation, and there's obviously a pond and a creek. This dashed line indicates a burn area. This hatched area is an erosion area, and there's obviously a clear cut up here. So this area has some issues. And the next step here would be to maybe shade in the area that you have deemed as a potential restoration project. All right, so how does this all fit into your workflow? So remember, in project development, you're coming up with your goals, objectives, actions. Then as you visit the site, that's when you start to do this. You start to assign strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and constraints to each of those categories that we just discussed. You go over those with your team. You make sure everybody saw the same thing as you did. And then you can take that information and begin to inform your feasibility analysis. That will help you refine your goals and objectives to be more realistic, and then determine your project requirements. Remember, I mentioned that in the last lecture. These are the things that absolutely must happen for the project to proceed and succeed. So we're headed in that direction. SWOT-C is a very important stage in assessing the feasibility of a project. And there it is again. So I want to revisit South Slough, the project we talked about last week. And I'd like you to take some time now to look at that form in the appendix where you can, the SWOT-C form, and I want you to take what you know about this project and just do your best to work your way through this SWOT-C wheel, assigning an S, W, O, T, or C to each of these categories based on the project in front of you. And I understand that you don't know the project that well, you've never been on the site, but just use your imagination, and you know what? You can make it up if you like, as long as you justify it. So you're going to be filling out that form and then turning that in. And if you find another case study that you'd prefer to use, that's okay too, but given that we've already started discussing this project, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. Those of you in the ground course, of course, will get to do this in the field, but for everybody online, this is a good place to start using this skill. So remember that this is a floodplain that historically was wetland, and it was good juvenile salmon habitat, providing refuge and providing prey, and providing an opportunity to fatten up before they headed out to sea. But for many decades now, it's been cut off from the river by a tide gate. And there are also, remember, several artificial drainage ditches. So you have your tide gate here by the road. You have lots of unusual ditch features on the landscape. But then upstream, up that creek, up Colwart Creek, you have nice habitat. It's just not available to adult salmon. So this site has the potential to both serve juvenile salmon in the lower portions of the property when you restore these wetlands, and then adult salmon up in the creek in the headwaters where they can spawn in those gravels. So it's a high value project, and it's about 33 acres. It's pretty straightforward. You got one landowner, it's a national park, and they're motivated to work with you. And then across the street, let's see if I can get my mouse to work here. It is not cooperating. There we go. Across the street, this little triangle of land here, this is a very similar wetland that was diked and levied and cut off from the river, but breached itself naturally back in the 60s. So it is as close to a reference site as you're going to find in the area, and it's nice because it's right across the road. So that's a potential opportunity, of course, that you have a pristine area to compare your work to. So you can track the progress of your work over time. Hopefully, in the end, after a few years, the sites begin to look a lot like each other. So, email me questions about this project if you need more information, but do your best. I'm not expecting perfection, but do your best to work your way through this SWOT-C wheel with respect to this project. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to connecting with you online later on. Thanks a lot.